Kubrick's Universe, Episode 1, Mick Broderick, Real One. Our highly skilled team are focused on bringing you the optimal experience.
So many answers we may never know. Too many questions, get on with the show. No time for the chorus, only this verse. It's Kubrick's Universe.
Open the podcast doors, Hal.
It's Kubrick's Universe, the Stanley Kubrick Podcast.
Where's my shorts?
Where's the bathroom?
Buck, should I get it?
On the hotline.
Dr. Strangelove.
Or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and
Love the bomb. A moving picture.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Kubrick's Universe. At the boards is Mr. Extraordinary, our producer Stephen Rigg. I am your host and humble narrator, Jason Furlong. So, for our first episode, we are very pleased to have as our first guest, Mr. Mick Broderick. Now, Mick is Associate Professor of Media Analysis in the School of Arts at Murdoch University in Perth, Australia. He's also Acting Director of the National Academy of Screen and Sound. Mick's first book was published in 1988, and it was entitled Nuclear Movies, a critical analysis and filmography of international feature-length films dealing with experimentation, aliens, terrorism, Holocaust. He has also served as editor of 3 books, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Nuclear Image in Japanese Film, Interrogating Trauma, Collective Suffering in Global Art and Media, and Trauma, Media, Art, New Perspectives. So today, we are very pleased to have him as our first interviewee because Mick is going to be talking with us about his current book titled Reconstructing Strangelove, Inside Stanley Kubrick's Nightmare Comedy, which Mick describes as a research monograph, if you will. That is, it's about the movie's genesis, development, and assumption of its final form. And this book really sets the record straight about much of the lore and the legends that have grown up around the movie. The Sunday Times title for the review of Mick's book was Stanley Kubrick's Plan to Flee Nuclear Attack Foiled by Toilet Phobia. A very brief synopsis of Mick's book. In the beginning, we learn about Kubrick's coming of age during the Cold War and his preoccupation with the likelihood of World War III. It covers the development of the script from getting the rights to Peter George's book through the many iterations and writers to the final controversy over Terry Southern's contributions versus everyone else's. It discusses the various individuals who were possible role models and being for the character of Dr. Strangelove, and also how that character was developed further by the writers and Peter Sellers himself. The book examines the battle between Dr. Strangelove and the very similar movie Failsafe, how accurately Kubrick's film presents the facts and the military's safeguards, and whether or not the events depicted in Kubrick's film could actually happen. The book, towards the end, reconstructs many of the scenes which were in fact shot but left out of the final movie. And in the conclusion, it discusses Kubrick's film and enduring legacy to this day. I guess my first question would be regarding how many of your books and articles do deal with the prospect of nuclear holocaust and other forms of mass suffering. My question would be, how did you come to be interested in these kinds of topics?
I guess I've had an abiding interest in the representation of the nuclear era, not only through film and television, but also increasingly through popular media culture and through material artefacts. So I've been amassing quite a collection of Cold War artifactual material, mostly off eBay. There's several thousand items now that occasionally are displayed in museum exhibitions around the world. But I guess what led me to think about the ubiquity of representations of the nuclear age was film and television. I grew up in Australia as a Cold War kid, growing up in the 1960s. And Australia at that time was really awash with American and British programming because there wasn't a strong domestic industry producing drama television. So we imported a lot of espionage series, science fiction series, military programming. AEC propaganda films in compilation style ended up being shown as like Saturday matinees along with The Man for Uncle or Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which just rehearsed all of these narratives of a potential nuclear threat, whether it was a secret agent, The Men from Uncle, Danger Man. It just seemed to me at some point in my late teens that somehow there was this underlying narrative that was projecting a future or a kind of immediate future that may lead to nuclear disaster through terrorism, megalomania, accident, alien invasion, or nuclear war. And it was when I was an undergraduate at RMIT University doing a media degree that I wrote a large undergraduate thesis, about 30,000 words, on Kubrick's cinema as an auteur. So that was something that started me thinking about Dr. Strangelove in a more concerted way. And of course that coincided with the resurgence of what was termed the Neo-Cold War during the Thatcher, Reagan, Gorbachev era. So there was this palpable threat, I guess, that potentially weapons could be used in a first strike scenario that may lead to global nuclear war. So that heightened sensibility and cultural reframing of Cold War cinema and television started me on the path that ended up being Reconstructing Strangelove. So the genesis really goes back to my childhood, but the first serious scholarly work stemmed out of that undergraduate thesis and then that book, The Filmography, in 1988.
Do you mind if I ask how old were you when you first saw Dr. Strangelove?
I'm guessing I was in my mid-teens. I think I took some days off school, either legitimately or illegitimately, and was watching television in the, pretending to be sick probably. And lo and behold, Dr. Strangelove pops up on television. And I remember my first screening, a kind of sense of ambivalence because I was amazed and shocked and appalled, but also delighted at the irreverence of the satire, and that you could end a film with this reverie of montage of nuclear explosions. So I was probably a little bit naive around the sexual double entendre, but of course subsequent viewings, particularly during my university years, I was all the way with Kubrick at that point.
Right. That's interesting. I have roughly the same story to tell, in that I first discovered Strangelove. I believe it was the third Kubrick film I saw, and I was about 15, 16 as well. And as you said, some of the nuances were lost on me at first, but I was rather drawn to it, and I was part of the end of the Cold War era, as I'm sure a lot of the younger folks in SCAS, and, well, most of us in general, did grow up with some aspect of the Cold War affecting our lives. So,
well, I'm sure, if I can just interrupt, I think, I was totally unaware of Stanley Kubrick. I'd seen 2001 on first release as a child at the age of 8 or 9.
Wow.
I'm not sure it was Cinerama, but it was certainly a massive widescreen exhibition in Melbourne. And probably in my early teens, I saw Spartacus again at the local cinema in 70mm. So I'd been exposed to Kubrick's cinema at the theatre, but I encountered Strangelove on television. But I didn't put two and two together until later, and that got me on the road of following him as an auteur.
In relation to previous books of yours, that had dealt, you dealt with atomic war from a more broad perspective. Was there something in particular that drew you to do an in-depth study and write Reconstructing, to focus on a single movie based on your background in a broader perspective?
I'd been thinking about this for a long time, and a parallel development was I got a visiting fellowship to UCLA to look at the Stanley Kramer archive. So I spent a month there looking at his files on the beach, and this was about 1999. And around about the same time, I was engaged with alt movies Kubrick as the Usenet group while working for the Australian Film Commission in Sydney. And when Kubrick died, I waited a year or two and reached out to his daughter Katharina, who had since announced her presence on that group. And I pitched the idea of this reconstruction work, looking at Kubrick's work as a kind of historical archive. And at that time, the family were working on a life, the Kubrick biography that Jan Harlan directed, and they were just starting to think about what to do with his massive archive. But fortunately, they allowed me to come along. So getting back to that parallel development, originally I was going to do a book on the beach, which I'm still going to do, but the Kubrick archive far outweighed the Stanley Kramer archive. So, I knew I had at least a decade's work ahead of me just because of the bulk of the material. But also what made me turn to Strangelove was that having done this large, big picture overview of 7 or 8 decades of nuclear films from around the world, it still stood out as a landmark. It really was a beacon. So there was something that was so powerful and had such allure.
As a sidebar, do you find there is anything, obviously not exactly like Strangelove, but have there been other films that deal with this topic struck you personally?
Not necessarily global thermonuclear war, but I'm a big fan of Tarkovsky's Stalker. The nuclear relevance there is the professor who takes in a small kiloton device to blow up whatever this entity is that exerts this force in the zone. And there's that philosophical exchange between the writer, Stalker, and scientist as he's about to, nuke whatever this thing is, and they fight over this small device, and eventually they throw it into the water. But what's interesting for me about that is that mirrors a very early British film. And again, this is probably jet lag happening here. Someone can probably chime in on this. I think it was 7 Days to Noon by the Bolting brothers, where a disaffected British atomic scientist develops a suitcase nuke, and he threatens London that he'll explode it unless there's universal disarmament. So here's this kind of screen representation of these small, portable, lightweight nuclear weapons into very different international contexts, and yet all throughout the post-September 11 I would say hysteria about the idea of there being a suitcase nuke taking out New York, a la the Peacemaker movie. You can find, when you've done these large surveys of films across time, you see themes repeating themselves, and it's interesting to chart how those tropes play out at a particular time in a particular place, and match them against the geopolitics of the time.
Indeed, as I'm sure we all listening in can remember that time. I want to go back just briefly. I believe you were talking about On the Beach and Stanley Kramer. I wondered if you had anything to add about that.
Well, maybe somewhere along the line in my childhood psyche, the idea of being born in Melbourne when Hollywood came to town to make a film about the end of the world might have somehow seeped into my subconscious. But Kramer's film is very interesting because it was originally based on Neville Shute's novel, which was serialised in the newspapers in North America before it became a best-selling book. And then it got adapted for radio. Then Kramer made the film. It was subsequently made into a 2-part TV series in the late 90s. It's also then been serialised again as a radio drama, and now I know someone's working on a libretto for an opera. So what I intend doing with that is seeing how that story about, you know, the gradual entropic end of humanity in this very kind of stoic way, why it plays out in these different, you know, media forms at these different times. So I think there's a great deal that can be done in this new film history archaeology that seems to be emerging. You know, people like Peter Kramer has done great work with the Kubrick archives, and partly led that resurgence back towards looking at historical first primary materials rather than just, you know, textual aesthetic analysis.
I guess to get back a bit to the publishing, now there's a chapter on the Strangelove outtakes, which had originally appeared in this anthology called New Perspectives, which came out a few years ago. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of that book. I bought it, you know, the day it came out. How did that come about? And did it help you find a publisher for your work, Reconstructing Strangelove as a whole?
So in 2008, you know, I'd actually spent 2 weeks at Chittickbury in the Kubrick house, and that was before the archive shifted to the College of the Arts. Mm-hmm. So I had a lot of encounters with the archivist there, in particular Richard Daniels, and Richard advised me that he was going to get a collection of works that visiting scholars had done to showcase the materials and provide some new perspectives, literally new perspectives on Stanley Kubrick. Yep. So, you know, I was very pleased to be asked to do that, and I chose as a foci what I'd never really seen anyone in any scholarship anywhere look at the continuity reports, the daily continuity reports that presented for the studio, along with, you know, the rushes to kind of show how many takes there were, what the camera angles were, who the DOP was, the date, the location, the cast, and of course the continuity scripts, or I should say the continuity recordings of the individual takes. And once in a while I'd seen a smattering of those works in bits of scholarship, but nothing that comprehensively looked at a range of material so that you could see not only the shooting ratio but also why certain takes were selected. And you know, if you look at particularly the war room sequences, there's a few kind of clunky cuts, particularly early on. And as I went through those continuity reports, I realised that Kubrick was shooting around cellars, particularly as he was doing this business in the early scenes where he had a heavy cold. So he was honking into his handkerchief and putting inhalers into his nostrils, and, you know, doing the business. You know, you can imagine how hilarious that must have been.
Oh my,
but when they decided to play it straight, all of those earlier shots had to be cut back and worked around. Yes. So the continuity reports, you know, showed I could basically say what camera angle, what scene on what day was matched with one, you know, several weeks later.
Wow.
But also the surprising thing was all of the material that was excised. And it was disappointing to me. I wrote a lengthier piece on the pie fight sequence, but the estate, and when I say the estate, I don't mean the Kubricks, I mean the controlling legal administrative body decided that in their wisdom that no mention of the pie fight should be made, even though it's like trying to deny, you know, back on the September 11 trope, an event like this took place. So it's
right.
It's so well known. It seems counterproductive to do that. But anyway,
nothing to see here. Move along.
So anyway, I did manage to get a little bit of that into the book. But yeah, so that was really an intervention, I guess, to kind of recuperate these wonderful textual documents that are absolutely smoking guns. You can see how many takes, you can see what lines were changed. You can, for example, Terry Southern's son, Niall, who I spent a bit of time with early on in this project, he was very curious to find out how much his dad had actually contributed in terms of, the words that were used. And, there are certain ad-libs that seem so Southern-like, but in actual fact, you can see from the continuity reports that some of these things either Sellers made up or certainly Slim Pickens made up.
Mm.
Now, they didn't all make the cut, but you can see how Kubrick created an atmosphere on set that enabled people just to go off and riff and offer variations, and he just ate this stuff up. He loved it. So there was a lot of coverage, but not a lot of prints. Like he knew exactly what he wanted, so he wasn't printing, 5 of the 7 takes. He'd only print 1 or 2.
Mm-hmm.
So effectively, I could show empirically that he was pretty much very close to standard Hollywood shooting ratios, at least for Strangelove.
That's interesting. I mean, beyond interesting. And on behalf of a lot of cinephiles, I'm sure I say, find it awesome that Stanley was open to interpretation, given that there's long been a mythology surrounding his approach to filming, that he was too didactic, etc. But from all accounts, he was just very open to things happening on the spot. As a film fan, that's something I always loved learning about Stanley, is that, contrary to popular belief, he was, very open to input from others, etc.
I mean, he was certainly no Svengali. I mean, he deliberately inculcated an atmosphere that welcomed critical contributions. So you could be on set as a member of the crew, and if you had an idea, it may not be you that would have taken it to Kubrick, but someone would have got in his ear. And I think this is the genius of Kubrick, was that he had the intellect and the capacity to simultaneously contemplate and really critically think through any number of multitudinous scenarios. You know how noisy and busy, film sets are, particularly the industrial studio model. Imagine how much was going on in his head, yet he would take time to listen to ideas from people, and if they tickled his fancy, he'd give it a crack.
It does seem to be the mark of a very unique breed of leader that knows that sometimes to lead means to follow. And by that I mean, the input of others, and to, go where the river takes you. And I think Stanley was just absolutely in tune with that, personally, based on everything I've read. And what you're saying backs that up.
I think because of that openness and because of his willingness to experiment and receive suggestions from multiple players, it also did put him in touch with the zeitgeist. He would say that falling in love with an idea is the hardest thing. Finding that script, finding that book, finding that source inspiration, but also keeping that love affair going from development through to post-production, through to distribution. Of course it's an obsessive thing, but he was also, I would assume, keenly aware that he did need various multiple inputs from others to keep it honest. So he never lost the singular vision of what he was doing, but he certainly understood that other people could have nuanced interpretations and things to offer during that love affair.
That's fascinating. And yes, keeping that love affair, flourishing from the beginning on through is the crux of the matter there. Not unlike real life, if I may add. But anyway, to move along, I gotta ask about Marvin Minsky and the way you, in your book, you related a story from Minsky, and of course a friend of Stanley's, and I have a quote in front of me of his, which said, "Upon news of the superpowers agreeing to halve, halve their nuclear warheads, Kubrick felt the announcement was really pathetic because it can't really make any difference as long as they have enough to destroy the world. He said, I wish, Stanley said, can't anybody get through to them to make them realize that they've got to do something much more effective than that? To continue quoting you, Minsky had observed that many years earlier, Kubrick had himself made a movie called Dr. Strangelove, which explained the point far more clearly than anybody could possibly do. So Strangelove was a massive success at the box office. It entered into the popular culture's consciousness and, subconsciousness, really, as the years went on. In your opinion, from that time forward, and of course this was all, we know that the original release date was tragically, unknowably timed with what turned out to be JFK's assassination. So there was that, as you said, of course, the zeitgeist. There was that moment in history, and it's this strange convergence of events, and Dr. Strangelove comes out. So given Minsky's quote and Stanley's, banging his head at this madness, I wonder if you think, given the impact that Strangelove had at the time, continued to have, and still has to this day, more so than ever, perhaps, what would you regard the impact, how meaningful the impact of the film on actually reducing the risk of nuclear war, given that Strangelove is a film known around the world?
Kubrick was very conscious of the fact that his artistic endeavours didn't really have the power to change things necessarily. In fact, it was more about reflecting the world and reflecting his own particular interests back to himself and to, international audiences. So part of that reflection hopefully leads to contemplation and some, particularly when you're dealing with the potential ecocide of the planet, that by contemplating these things, you would be more sensitive, more perhaps attuned to political issues or other military kind of things, So I don't think when he said to Minsky, someone should do something, he of course had done something, as Minsky pointed out to him. I don't think that was a senior moment on Kubrick's part. I think he genuinely was exacerbated by that this continued to go on and that the threat wasn't being diminished. But I think we can take a leaf out of Oliver Stone's playbook when he showed Dr. Strangelove to Vladimir Putin recently.
Another fascinating topic, yes. During
the Putin interviews.
Yeah.
And I have no doubt, Putin was very bemused watching this. It probably confirmed his idea of, the extravagance or the irrelevance of the American entertainment industry. But I don't think it would have any lasting impact on Putin. It clearly did on Stone, enough for him to, take time to show it to Putin. So I think there are these secondary influences, but it's very hard to draw conclusions about primary causal relationships between any work of art.
I was an 80s teen, and I grew up under Ronnie Reagan and Gorbachev and good old Maggie. And I wonder, if there was, as Strangelove entered into the popular culture, and it's hard to think, but in 1984, when, Reagan was elected to his second term, Strangelove had only been out for 20 years at that time. I say only 20 years, but as we all know, that goes by pretty quick now. So do you have any recollection? I mean, it's just your take on it. And I have a limited perspective as I was a young chap, but we had a film, a made-for-TV movie called The Day After in the United States. It aired. It was a big event. It happened during one of Reagan's two terms. And with regard to the potential for Strangelove to reduce the risk of nuclear war and have some kind of a meaningful impact in popular culture. Had you done any research at all regarding the 80s and the end of the end, I say, of the Cold War era as it was under Reagan?
Yeah, the 80s actually informed my PhD. I did my PhD on the Mad Max cycle of post-Holocaust films.
Oh, love it.
And that kind of coincided not only with punk aesthetic and punk politics, but the way that the Mad Max sub-genre of films that emerged, they just blossomed out of nowhere internationally because they could be made cheaply, I guess. Exploitation movies, but it certainly kind of tapped into something that was going on in the shared cultural collective consciousness, I guess, around the world, predicated, and this is, I can't really underline this point enough, predicated on nuclear war being a fait accompli. These are not films about a nuclear war. These are films about a nuclear war happened, and it's happened long ago, and who and how do people survive? So as a kind of ideological analysis, you can look at these films in ways that are quite disturbing in the sense that it's almost like politically there's no point even contesting the possibility of nuclear war happening. It's happened. We're going to collectively imagine scenarios in which this is inevitable, and who's going to survive and how are they going to survive. So that was one aspect of the 1980s. The other one was that what emerged in the late 70s and early 80s was this horrifying prospect that the global thermonuclear war would lead to so much material and debris through firestorms and particulate matter being pushed up into the upper atmosphere that this would circle the globe for decades, causing long-term nuclear winter. So I think a film like Threads, or a TV program like Threads, was the first to actually envisage some long-term consequences of a nuclear winter. And scientists are telling us now that only a very small amount of a nuclear exchange, such as 100 weapons between, let's say, Pakistan and India, would lead to a global nuclear winter. So still, these are things that aren't actually being presented. This is the science. This is telling us what even a limited exchange might lead to. So, but again, this kind of apocalyptic imagination was very strong in the 1980s, and it's continued. As we got closer to the millennium, there are all kinds of disaster films being made. But, sorry, this is the PA system. So, yes, there hasn't been a diminution of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic scenarios. The whole, zombie phenomena is another expression of that.
I was going to get to that, yes.
I wouldn't want to suggest that all of these are allegories of nuclear war or post-nuclear war. Not at all. They have their own particular tropes and narrative structures and themes that get repeated. I mean, the apocalyptic is something that's, dominant in most societies. But, we just happen to be living at a time where Homo sapiens developed the capacity to literally bring about the end of the world as far as our species is concerned.
Right.
So, for millennia, this was the domain of a deity or some kind of cosmic force, not, and I mean this literally, man-made endeavour. So, and this kind of came about in the latter half of the 20th century in the lead up to, of course, the second millennium. In Christian theology, the idea of an imminent, perhaps, return of a Christ who might bring about apocalypse. So all of these things came about in the late 20th century, and I think much of the disaster and much of the apocalyptic engagement is also pushback against globalisation. There's so many things we could talk about, but all I wanted to say was I wouldn't try to conflate nuclear anxiety with the emergence and the resilience of zombie tropes in film and television.
Yeah, understood. As a general movie buff, I did notice that at some point after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there did seem to be this this rather false sense of peace which crept into at least American films and entertainment, that it did sort of veer away from, I mean, we had films like, big box office hits like Hunt for Red October, which dealt with the peripheral issues of potential nuclear war. But as the 90s wore on, there did seem to be a tendency for Hollywood to veer away from it. And then, of course, after 9/11 happened, things did change. And unfortunately, ever since, it's been all too much a part of our daily reality now, leading up to our current situation.
Yeah, I wrote a piece precisely reflecting on that change of sensibility called Is This the Sum of All Fears? Again, I did a kind of a quick survey of about 500 films after my book was finished, which was 1991, 2004. So I was looking at these maps that you're speaking about, the way there was a perceived reduction in threat. But what happened during that period was that there was a nostalgia for, in particular, the kind of Kennedy Camelot era. So there are a number of films set in the early 60s that dealt with, the nuclear threat. Some as entertainment, some as a little bit more reflective on the geopolitics. But then again, as you said, after 9/11, suddenly there was a resurgence in the idea of nuclear terrorism. But of course, this nuclear terrorism's always been with us. It was going back to communist subversives, bringing in bombs into American harbours, or it was megalomaniac scientists, the James Bond adversaries. So you look at and this theme and cultural expression over decades, you can see these peaks and troughs and how they align at particular times, what becomes popular, what becomes less popular. And as with the Hunt for Red October, there were about 4 or 5 films made around that era that all were dealing with nuclear submarines that were either involved in accidents or potentially with rogue crews. And so somehow the stars just align, and it's a bit like Armageddon and Deep Impact, and you get these little waves of films that deal with similar issues that just happen to come out of Hollywood or elsewhere, reflecting fears. But given that these scenarios generally take, a couple of years of development and then maybe a year of production and release, it's coincidental that they come out at the same time. But there's the germination for these ideas have probably preceded them by about maybe 4 or 5 years, depending on the development process.
Mick, I have, so many other questions I could ask you, and we're so grateful that you're, that we're keeping you company. Frankly, you should be thanking us. No, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. I'm just going to ask you one last question, and then I'd love to turn the floor over to everyone else in SCAS, Stephen, James, Mark, Anthony, Scott. I see Maria has joined us from Mexico City. It's regarding the late author Philip Dick, who in 1965 had wrote what he considered an unofficial sequel to Dr. Strangelove. I'm sure you're familiar, perhaps. More
Dr. Blood Money?
Yes, sir, the one. That's the one. Any indication that you're aware that Stanley had a reaction to it, or do you know if he'd read it? No,
I mean, I didn't see on his bookshelf, but I was in his library in Chittockbury, which is this beautiful, large. Actually, it's the walls are blood red. It's a bit like being inside the shining toilet, but it's not full of urinals, obviously. But it's very ornate and lovely. But the walls are blood red. He was quite a science fiction fan, so there are many volumes of science fiction works on his shelves. Now, most of that library's now been donated to the Stanley Kubrick Archive in London. So, a quick check on that would be to, go to their website and look at their listings and see if it is listed. But Kubrick was pretty litigious when it came to protecting that elongated name of Dr. Strangelove. So I think had it been turned into a film, he would have likely issued legal proceedings so that the name would have been changed to something else. I'll give an example. I think the filmmaker's name was Ray Sackler, who made, and again, I'm going to mix up the title because I am jet lagged. It was something like Incredible Monsters Who Became Something and Turned Up Zombies, or...
Look, then run for your life. Incredible is the word for the world's first monster musical. See in magnificent Eastman color, the daring, dancing, enticing, and horrifying, the incredibly strange creatures who stopped living and became mixed-up zombies.
Someone from Columbia got in touch with him, and he was making this low-budget kind of horror comedy movie, and Kubrick objected to the title being used, but ultimately there was a compromise because it was understood that this wasn't really going to threaten the commercial interests of Dr. Strangelove.
Right.
So whether or not he sent the publisher of Dick's novel the kind of cease and desist, I don't know, but that might have been an example. Had it been turned into a film, or had options been given to turn it into a film, there might have been some intervention to try and prevent that long, elongated, similar title being used. But pure speculation on my part.
No, hardly speculation at all. You got to be there, my man, and I just have to know, man. Like, how did you feel being invited? What was it like? I mean, as Kubrick enthusiasts for life, I'm sure we're all dying to know, like, what it felt like to be able to walk into that room, to touch those boxes, to start sifting through, to smell the air, frankly.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it was magic, and I mean, Christiana and Katharina and Jan, they were so gracious, and we had lunch every day together, and I think they had this ethos. The way it was explained to me, they had a very large kitchen with floor to ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, and anyone who was working at the estate, in any way, shape or form, there would be down tools at 1 o'clock, and they would all get together and have this communal lunch. And while I was there, Christiana was arranging, I think it was monthly, or it might have been weekly, monthly painting lessons for people from the local community. So they'd kind of come along and undertake some free art classes, and then they'd all hoe into this big buffet lunch. And it was great to see, again, it just totally, pricked the balloon of this idea that, Kubrick was, a misanthrope. He was a recluse. I mean, Jan brought the director of the Decalogue along, and, so people, he would always say, the world came to Stanley. Stanley wasn't shy of the world. But also, part of that generosity was sitting at the two large tables with all of these boxes of materials that probably no one had actually opened since 1965. It really was literally, it took my breath away at one point. I just thought, oh my God, And I love doing archival work. I think it's one of the great joys of being a film historian, both to sit in front of a Steenbeck and have that celluloid, run through, but also just to go through those papers, and it's the pleasure of discovery, but it's really rediscovery, because, of course, all I'm doing is just shining a light on materials that are already there. And, my incredibly meagre contribution to understanding Strangelove just pales infinitely into insignificance compared to the mastery of Kubrick's research and his ability to kind of contain all this information and somehow make a lasting contribution to understanding something about this nuclear age that we're all still living in, and do it in a way that had great humour, great understanding, and also stays with us today.
I want to go to a shift, if I may, and it's in regards to Columbia Pictures, of course, and who distributed the film. The publicist Sid Gaines, who'd worked on the marketing campaign, he from what I understand, he'd arranged for Slim Pickens to go on The Tonight Show in January of '64 because Stanley and the film stars Peter Sellers, George Scott, they were, publicity shy, to put it one way. Do you know if that interview has ever been shown since original broadcast? Is it lost now?
No, I did try and find it in the UCLA archive because they had they'd kept a number of I guess their kinnies of those old TV shows, but I couldn't find it. But it wasn't just Slim Pickens. Tracy Reed, Sterling Hayden also were involved in doing similar type of television interviews. I don't know whether George Scott actually did. Sellers, of course, at that point was just all over the shop. He was working on multiple films. He'd had heart attacks. He was going through divorces. So it was a bit of a big ask. I know that Kubrick was also a bit uninterested really in turning up to the BAFTAs or the Academy Awards. So there's correspondence in the archives where he was asking Sellers if he would stand in for him, if there was an award to be accepted. So, and again, I don't think this was necessarily shyness on Kubrick's part. I think he just felt that other people were better at doing this. That's why he really didn't like giving interviews, partly because he didn't necessarily want to provide an authorial stamp on something that he hoped would be open to interpretation. But also because, Katharina said this to me, he just felt really lame and inadequate. Which is stunning when you read how incredibly articulate and intelligent he is.
It's amazing. I mean, you read, for instance, the 1968 Playboy interview, one of the few at-length pieces we have, and to read it on the page, it says that he composed his speech in conversation with fully comprehensive, grammatically correct sentences. Incredible level, strands of thought, and yet totally cohesive. The ultimate gear shifter, I like to call them. The highly compartmentalized brain and his ability to translate. I always found that paradoxical that he was either camera shy or just felt that he wouldn't make an interesting guest on a chat show where all like you'd be the most fascinating guest of all time. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, Mick, on that note, I'm just going to thank you again. You've given me an hour to answer questions. I'd really love to, to turn the floor over to everyone else if you're willing to hang with us, man.
Sure.
Cool. Okay, gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourselves and anyone with us?
Hello.
We have Ian.
Hi. I don't know whether this was raised before. Unfortunately, I only came in on the call about half an hour ago. But I just finished reading the book and I loved it. Really enjoyed it. And it sort of was so informative on so many different levels, not just the film, but the background to the nuclear strategy and nuclear philosophy at the time. So thank you for that. It was a great read. There's one little bit that you mentioned in it, which was which I've seen numerous things on the internet about, which was the FBI or somebody getting involved and seeing the inside of the B-52 layout, and wonder, and Kubrick getting worried about the FBI getting involved. Some of the things I've seen suggest that there was a bit of an investigation.
Yeah, and good to hear your voice, Ian. I hope you're doing well. I am going to write a piece on this. Because as I was researching the book, I went through an FIO request. Actually, Tony Fruin, Kubrick's longtime assistant, suggested that Stanley had always wondered whether or not he just assumed he would have had an FBI file. Because I'd asked this question: was he under investigation? There are those reminiscences by Ken Adam that he thought that maybe he was under investigation, or at least he relays the story that he said you'd better be able to have evidence that these were open source materials that you base the production design of the B-52 for in case we come under investigation. So there's been a little bit of conflation around the idea that does it actually mean they were under investigation? And as it turns out, the FOI requests I've done, I've also put them in not just with the FBI but with the CIA. CIA haven't got back to me, and the reason I went to the CIA was because as a foreign national working in the UK, the FBI wouldn't be sending agents out to do investigations. It would either be CIA or Defence Intelligence Agency or perhaps the Air Force Intelligence Bureau. So as it turned out, there's very little material through those FOI requests. What did turn up was Kubrick being referenced and the film being referenced by former Chief of Navy Admiral Arleigh Burke, who in response to a couple of other films, such as 7 Days in May, around that time, mentions Kubrick's film along with others as being part of a perhaps anti-military or anti-kind of Pentagon wave of Hollywood film productions. But there's a very telling note in strange FBI speak where it says there are no bureau files on Kubrick. So he was basically a clean skin, which came as a bit of a surprise. Now, there were quite a lot of files that related to Kubrick that were found, but those files actually were investigations and recordings of someone that had worked on a Kubrick film who was regarded as a kind of communist sympathiser. So, Kubrick's name appeared in, phone addresses and address books and things like that. So in no way was he implicated. He just happened to be picked up in the sweep of documents. So I think it's pretty fair to say, unless the FBI have deliberately and deceitfully not found those materials, that there was no FBI investigation.
Okay.
Now, I can also pretty categorically say that Peter George, as a result of him writing the book, had a visit, according to his daughter, had a visit to his home by a couple of to the RAF base he was stationed at. This is before the film was made, 61 I think it was. Two intelligence agents. Now, she said they were CIA, but I think they were probably Air Force intelligence. They came and interrogated him for about 2 hours, basically saying, where did you get this information about where all these nuclear facilities in the Soviet Union were? And he said, look, I just opened up a map and I kind of looked at where would be the most remote yet industrial base, and I basically put two and two together and I suggested that. So eventually they were satisfied that there was nothing around a security issue or he divulged secret information. And the anecdote that his daughter says, that on the way out they said, oh, by the way, the president has read your book and he liked it very much. Now, in fact, JFK was a voracious reader and he loved reading nuclear thrillers. So I haven't done the follow-up on this, but probably in the presidential library will be 7 Days to Noon, not 7 Days to Noon, 2 Hours to Doom, or Red Alert, whichever version he had. So that's my take on, the security apparatus getting involved in the film or the book.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ian. James, are you there, sir?
I think the question I have may have been completely covered in your book, which I read, but I just don't recall. But I'm really curious about that strange distributor trailer that Kubrick narrates. It's really 10 minutes long. Did that have anything to do with the confusion over, Failsafe and Strangelove came out around the same time from the same studio, and
in actual fact, James, there was an embargo. One of the terms of the settlement that Kubrick got was that there was a 6-month embargo placed on failsafe. It couldn't be released until Strangelove had both a national and Kubrick tried to get an international embargo as well. But certainly its domestic release was pushed back to, I think, something like October, whereas Strangelove had come out, which is a lot longer than 6 months. Mm-hmm. Strangelove got its initial mainstream release in late January '64. Mm-hmm. But the other thing on that exhibitor's showreel that, I mean, I do mention it mostly in some footnotes, so that's probably why you can't recall it, because I didn't spend much time on it, other than to note that if you look very closely at it, and it was so nice to see the Criterion Collection, getting the rights to it and doing a nice clean digital remastering of it, because I'd just been relying on pretty crappy YouTube videos, which I think have subsequently been taken down. But anyway, so one is to hear Kubrick's voice, and also the terminology, the way he encapsulates for these exhibitors. I'm not saying he was dumbing down the discourse, but he made it clearly simple and pretty straightforward what the theme of the film was, what the motivations of those characters were in the clips that he showed. But also he used outtakes. So that entire sequence, or virtually the entire sequence, I think it runs about 16 minutes.
It's about 16 minutes, yeah.
Yeah. That's composed of outtakes. So you also see scenes and shots that aren't in the film. And I make reference to that. For example, there's a scene where Mandrake goes to the bar and he gets the drinks that, Ripper talks about, drain water and alcohol and get whatever you want. So you actually see Mandrake at Ripper's office bar. There are a couple of other shots and bits of dialogue inside the B-52 that aren't in the film. So it's fascinating also for that reason. It's worth looking at it to give you a sense of, I think there are a couple of long master shots that he used in that showreel, but mostly for how he was presenting it to a pretty straightforward, exhibitor audience to try and encapsulate it in that brief period. And he's very apologetic that he's using master dialogue scenes, and he reminds the viewer that, of course there'll be any number of cutaways inserted, but you're watching the master takes of certain dialogue scenes.
Please remember as you watch this that the material is uncut and that there are many, many angles of the scene on all the characters. The President of the United States, Peter Sellers' second role, talks to the Soviet Premier Kisov. Next to him is the Russian ambassador. Again, please remember this is just one master dialogue take.
Hello, Dmitri. It's me again, Merkin.
So was there any, I'm trying to get a better hold on why he did it. Was he coerced by the studio? What did it have something to do with the confusion of drama versus comedy?
Yeah, good question. I didn't see anything in any of the documents that suggested why he did that himself. My guess would be that, it was done very early on. I mean, long before the final film was cut. So my guess is somewhere between May and probably before the scheduled premiere on 22nd of November 1963. So it would have been like a work in progress. And the rationale for it, I think you're probably on the money. Maybe he thought, look, this is going to be such an outrageous thing. It'd be good to get some word of mouth out there to provide literally his spin on it, his take on it, using his own voice and his own words, so that in case there's any pushback from the military or from critics, at least he would have had the exhibitors in the bag.
Cool. All right, thank you.
That's great. I think, like James, most of us were, so happy to see the and hear the exhibitors trailer when it came out. When I heard the announcement that Criterion was releasing it, went to the internet and saw it was going to have this. I'd never heard of this before. And then when I got it, and you get to hear him speak in such a relaxed conversation, it's like nothing that would be released as promotional material these days. You hear Stanley, coughing and just kind of talking his way through it, and it's just, it's remarkable. James, if you're still there, please feel free to ask more questions as long as Mick's hanging with us. Looks like we should be able to have time to get everybody's questions in.
I'm good.
James is good. Well, you're always good, my man. There's no doubting that. What would be awesome is to turn over the floor to Mark, because Mark Lentz is the man. He is a wonderful guy, and like all of us, avid enthusiast of Kubrick in general, specifically Strangelove, and I know that he is probably the most familiar with your book amongst us. He did a great deal of preparation and research. He's helped me and all of us in SCAS in so many ways. He initiated this call. I would love at this time, Mark, to turn it over to you. If you're there, my man, chime on in and speak with the guest of honor.
Oh, thanks so much, Jason. Both of my questions regard tragedies for Kubrick fans. First one is, you've spent a lot of time at the archives, and you do a great job of reconstructing the outtakes that were left out of Dr. Strangelove. Do any outtakes of any Kubrick films still exist anywhere, and will we ever get to see them, do you think?
I would think as long as Jan is alive, and I would assume, I'm not sure whether, I don't think Vivian's very active in the estate, although she is a member of that estate. But it's, as far as I understand, there are many lawyers and people from outside of the family that are involved in that estate. So if there are outtakes, although I've been told Kubrick destroyed everything, but he may not have, it will really be up to the discretion of the family in concert with the estate as to whether or not any of that material would ever be revealed, let alone exposed. The second point is, I think an example would be the pie fight sequence actually exists at the BFI library. Now, I tentatively asked Jan about getting access to that way back when, I think maybe in April 2005, and that was a categorical no. And he quite rightly said, look, this was Stanley's wish. I'm Stanley's executor, and that's where it sits. If he'd wanted it in the film, it would have been in the film. If he wanted people to see it, he actually, it wasn't accidental, but there was an arrangement around a kind of, I think during that early 60s period, around cultural preservation of film production. My understanding is that is why that print exists with the pie fight. It was almost like a mandatory deposit for cultural preservation. That's my understanding. So whether or not there's outtakes, for example, from Eyes Wide Shut, given that he passed away before Final Cut, it's probably fair to assume that if there is any residual material, it would be that. But I don't know for sure, and we'll just have to wait and see.
And as a follow-up, Mick, do you have an opinion about the argument that the artist should be able to make these decisions, or would it be a benefit to scholars ultimately to be able to see these outtakes?
Yeah, I think it'd be of great benefit. But also, Stanley, somewhere along the line, this isn't in the Strangelove material, but he certainly made it clear at some point that he didn't really like the idea of people looking at all of his draft scripts, simply because, these are unformulated, unfinished things. But the fact that he kept all of this material would suggest that he wasn't keen to throw it out, probably because not only of the intellectual and emotional investment that he spent, decades working on these research projects that would become films and others that didn't become films, but that he may in future find some utility, some purpose for this material. That's exactly why when he heard that all of that Arctic footage wasn't going to be preserved, or there was some threat that it may not be preserved by the studio, he made damn sure that it was, because he realised that, he had captured some of the most precious aerial photography of Greenland, Iceland, northern Canada, that no one else had done. So this had become almost geographical gold. So there's a lot of wisdom in him retaining this material. But what I said to Jan at some point was, it's a pity, imagine if Franz Kafka's wishes had have been fulfilled by his estate. All of those manuscripts would have been destroyed.
Great point.
So I on the one hand, I understand and respect the rights of the people controlling that, but my desire is that would be made accessible if there were outtakes to be seen.
Okay,
go ahead.
Second question's a little more complicated. Kubrick ultimately chose to tell his movie about nuclear holocaust as a comedy. He was to have made one other film about a Holocaust, Aryan Papers, but at the last minute decided to abandon the project. Tony Fruin says it was because of Schindler's List being released just as they were starting production, and Kubrick worried that it would kill the box office for his film. Christiane Kubrick says Stanley became deeply depressed during his researching of the Holocaust project, and maybe that was the real reason he gave it up. Mick, as someone who has researched such topics extensively, do you also become deeply depressed about them at times? Would it have been impossible for Kubrick to make a film about such a topic while maintaining the sense of detachment that is a hallmark of his films?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. I think my perspective on that would be that he did go through a similar process of angst, disbelief, and of course, the natural human reaction. And this is something that Jimmy Harris has mentioned. He himself, Kubrick, has written about, and Christiana related to me, is that he would break up. You would naturally turn to gallows humour when you're sitting across from Herman Kahn and he's speaking at 1,000 miles a minute, rattling off Megadeth numbers, talking about humans, turned into numbers. This is precisely the genocidal mentality that informed, the Third Reich's extermination programs. And, Stanley was deeply conscious of the resonance with that. And in fact, there were a couple of note cards in his Strangelove material where he talks about, lemmings jumping off a cliff and, this is just like the Jews. And he said to Christiana when they were debating whether they would come to Australia or not, he said, we're just like the Jews in Berlin, in denial, the threats all around us, but, we're not acting. We're kind of paralysed by it. So already during the Strangelove era, he was contemplating these issues, and it did take its toll. I remember Christiana saying that he looked at all of these newsreel footages of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the grotesquely damaged people from both radiation and burns and blast, and it was ghastly work. But he needed to be comprehensive and see everything and read everything. So yes, I'm sure it would have taken a huge emotional toll. And I also want to point out that I think Christiana really needs some recognition here as his pretty much his life partner. I mean, they were collaborators, intellectually, emotionally, artistically. So Stanley was really lucky to have such a supportive wife and such an intellectual and empathic person as Christiana, so that, at least he had somewhere to vent, he had somewhere to, express his concerns and his fears and his aspirations with her. So I think you're right. The pragmatic side is, of course, like Napoleon and the release of Waterloo, and like Platoon and the release of Full Metal Jacket, and potentially Aryan Papers was nixed because of that. But they were clearly greatly relieved that he not continue with that. But that doesn't mean that he wouldn't have possibly in the future had he lived.
I agree that the family has done an incredible job of promoting Stanley's legacy in so many ways. It would have been a great thing for the Australian film industry had Stanley followed up and moved to Australia. But
probably wouldn't have been a good thing for the Kubricks. I think Australia in circa 1961, 62, particularly if he came to Perth, would have been such a backwater. They would have been horrified.
Something tells me he would have adapted.
No doubt.
He does seem a very assimilable, even beyond most people's abilities.
He may well have just come and, done some scouting and waited for the Berlin crisis to dissipate or the Cuban crisis to dissipate. Or he may have decided, look, I'm going to make a film about Ned Kelly in Australia, or, use the resources a bit like the tax incentives that the British government gave to foreign productions. He was a good friend of Greg Peck, and he just made On the Beach, so they knew about the kind of tax system and what the production facilities were like in Australia, what the talent of the crew were. So he may well have come and shot a movie and then gone back to the UK or gone back to the States. Who knows?
Well, it's also likely he might have just said, this is the most delicious lobster I've ever had anywhere on the earth. I'm never leaving this place again.
Or he may have made Jaws in 1963.
Oh, my goodness. And what a different world we'd be living in had he beat Spielberg to that punch. Great stuff. And great stuff, Mark. I do see we have Anthony joining us. He is on holiday.
Hello.
There he is.
Hello. Hi. Firstly, Mick, thank you so much for your time. I can't tell you how enjoyable it is to listen to this.
Thanks for taking a break from your holiday.
Here.
Not at all. It reminds me why I want to spend the rest of my life interested in the work and films of Kubrick. Just a little question for you. You've done your own Kubrickian effort really with the book. It's 20 years in the making, it sounds like.
Well, I was pretty peripatetic. I mean, I was all over the shop during those, probably 17 years. The most intensive focus was in the last 18 months. But one of the great benefits of having the project take a long time to gestate was the spate of declassified documents that came out during those 15, 17 years. So I make a nice little dedication to the National Security Archive in the introduction, because they have just been so diligent at declassifying enormous amounts of mostly American nuclear policy, nuclear strategy, nuclear secrecy, including, of course, the smoking gun around the Strangelove scenario, when Eisenhower issued presidential pre-delegation for the expenditure of atomic weapons. So lower echelon commanders, as Peter George and then Kubrick developed in their film, were absolutely given the capacity to, without presidential authority, because it was pre-delegated under certain conditions, launch a nuclear attack against Russia. So while the Pentagon poo-pooed this through declassification, in recent years, we can absolutely show how valid and cogent that scenario is, and it still remains today, presumably.
Fantastic. Another little question. You interviewed some of Peter George's family. How were they? I mean, it must be a combination of sadness and pride over the story of their father. But any interesting anecdotes from meeting with them?
Yeah. Look, sadly, just before, just after the book came out, David, Peter's son and executor, died, and I'd spent a couple of visits when I was going to London, meeting up with David and going through his dad's archive and listening to his reminiscence. So David was also on a bit of a journey to try and rediscover as much as he could about his dad, because his dad took his own life, shot himself when David was about, I think he was a 6-year-old. So he had this huge loss and emptiness in his life. And in his later years, when I met him, he'd started to look at his dad's catalogue of works and reread them and try and get a sense as to how he was received, what people thought of him. So, as with Niall Southern, they were both very generous. And, of course, Katharina, who introduced me to the family, all of the major writing contributors through their children gave me access to, the various archives. But also his daughter, this is Peter George's daughter, Sarah, who was a lot older. She was fantastic, because one of the things that people like Baxter and others just endlessly repeat was this ridiculous notion that Peter George was a member of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Now, he was still an active serviceman when he was writing a lot of these works, and the idea that he would be a member of CND was kind of anathema to him, according to his daughter. It was actually she who was a member of CND as a kind of late teenager. So they had very robust debates about nuclear policy, nuclear strategy, the need for disarmament. And while Peter George was clearly interested in removing nuclear weapons, he wasn't a unilateralist, because he thought if Britain went along a unilateral road, that would make it vulnerable to attack by the Soviet Union and others through conventional and nuclear means. So, yeah, I mean, speaking with Sarah, she also provided those anecdotes about her father being investigated by either CIA, but I actually think it was probably the Air Force Intelligence Bureau, and the anecdote that JFK had read his book and wanted to tell the spooks to pass on. He liked it. So yeah, you never know what you're going to discover when you speak with people, particularly over a couple of repeat visits, when they get to know you and they trust you. So I've been very fortunate that people have opened up to me and embraced the idea of doing this as a kind of deeply researched historical work, rather than what they might perceive as yet another either fan-based or primarily aesthetic consideration of the film, all of which I think are important, of course, but I wanted to do something different.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks so much for taking a break. We all know you're on holiday. Please feel free.
This is a holiday from my holiday.
Yeah. You're a dad, that's how it works. You knew the deal when you signed the contract, I'm afraid.
Apparently.
I have an open floor. We've yet to get to the caretaker himself, Mr. Stephen Rigg, founder of SCAS and General Bon Vivant, professional gentleman of leisure, and all-around wonderful human being. We all know him. We all love him. Are you there, Stephen?
Hey, Stephen.
Hi, Mick. I've just got one quick final question. I wonder if you wouldn't mind recalling the story about Stanley's kind of idea to move to Perth.
Yeah, so the start of the book really, goes through the context that, Kubrick grew up into, his early professional life with Look magazine. Sorry, someone's bringing a drinks trolley past us as I speak.
Flag them down.
Without a drink for me, unfortunately. But
that's not right.
So what happened was, of course, growing up in New York, there were just endless stories, particularly pictorial feature articles about the atomic age and what a nuclear war would mean for the US. And this is while America had a monopoly on the weapons. This is before 1949. And, I detail a range of other kind of cultural influences around that period. But very early on, he started thinking about, and he wasn't alone in this, where would be a safe haven. So there was a dramatic move from atomic weapons to thermonuclear weapons. These things were 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it certainly became clear that not only would these things totally annihilate entire cities, like basically smear a city was the term that SAC would use, but the resulting fallout, by the mid-1950s, it was understood that the resulting fallout would spread over thousands and thousands of square kilometres. So you may avoid the thermonuclear blast heat, but you wouldn't avoid radiation. So there was a lot of stuff going on at the time, apart from the poisoning of the atmosphere through these atmospheric tests, was where could you possibly be where prevailing winds or even transhemispheric transference of radionuclides high up into the troposphere and stratosphere would dissipate so that you wouldn't actually be subjected to fallout. So he did his homework. He spoke with strategists. He looked on the map and worked out that the west coast of Australia would be, first of all, least likely to be attacked, and secondly, least likely to be subject to any fallout.
Wow.
So between August 61 and August 62, he started making moves around sending money into Australian bank accounts. He met with the embassy. He got visas for his wife and kids and himself. He was telling the embassy at the time that he was looking at, doing a recce, really kind of coming to consider making a production in Australia and, combining that with a family holiday. Although other documents show that, he was looking at permanent residency potentially, and what that would mean, because he didn't actually own his own house in America. He lived in various apartments. So this is before, in the interim period between Lolita and Dr. Strangelove, as he was developing this idea for a film on the thermonuclear problem. So potentially he was going to make Dr. Strangelove on the East Coast in New York. And then for various reasons, after Lolita, he thought, he'd stay in the UK because of the Edie plan and, the technicians he'd work with. But he'd also said at one point to Tony Harvey that, and I'm not sure whether this was around the time of editing Lolita, which was, again, during the Berlin crisis, before the Cuban crisis. But he actually thought, and I think erroneously, that it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But by that stage, he hadn't even started finalising the work on the film for Dr. Strangelove. So I think it was during the Berlin crisis. Kubrick had said to him, "Do you reckon you could work on a moviola on a ship to Australia?" So clearly these ideas were in his head, and he was going to continue to work. So, I speculate, would he have tried to make Dr. Strangelove Down Under? I don't know. I think he probably would have looked for an Indigenous story. But I quote him, I think it's around about the early 60s, where he says, look, you can really make a film anywhere, apart from natural geographical features, as long as you've got a good infrastructure, studio and talented crew, cast a transportable, you can make a movie on any topic anywhere. So that was his mindset.
Yeah. And he went on to do that time and time again, didn't he?
Exactly right. Yeah. That's right. So that's the other great myth, I think, where people say, he was holed up in Chittickbury or, Abbots Mead or, wherever, squirreled away, hiding from the world, working on his films. He was going to go to Europe to make Napoleon. He went to Europe to make Barry Lyndon. Well, he certainly went to Ireland. So he's pragmatic. He would have gone to places. He just would have gone by boat.
Great. Thanks for that, for giving us the old Australian story. Right, I'll hand you back over to Jason. Thanks,
Indeed,
Mick.
no.
Thanks, Mick.
Cheers.
Great stuff. Wow, thanks, Mick. Where can we and our listeners, where can everyone get a copy of Reconstructing Strangelove? That's my first question. And my last, on behalf of the group, was your next project, sir. What can we look forward to?
Okay, well, I'll start with the second one first.
Please.
James and a couple of other people will know, well, actually, you should all know as SCAS members, there was a call for papers around an anthology project and a special issue for the Film History Journal, Screening the Past, called Post Kubrick. Mm-hmm. That's now completed, and they're just doing the final HTML because it's an online open access journal. That should be out and available for people. There's 8 essays, mostly from a conference that was run in Leicester last year on Stanley Kubrick. And it's the theme of it is really looking at Kubrick's influence, basically, post-Kubrick. So after his death, how Kubrick's influence has kind of generated different kind of manifestations in film and culture. So that's coming out shortly. There'll be a companion anthology with some contributions from SCAS members, an anthology called Stanley Kubrick, A Legacy, and that should be in the pipeline in coming months. The other work I'm still going to get back to that On the Beach book, and a book on the Mad Max Quartet.
Oh my good! Oh wow!
So
well, I know
they're the irons in the fire, and so I've got a bit of an agenda to keep me going, keep me busy for a little while, and the book is available. You can get it through Amazon.
Of course.
I think the Kindle's pretty cheap. The Kindle version, I think, is like $15 or something. I think the paperback's $20.
Mark's a big fan of the Kindle version. He says it's just very well laid out. He's recommending it.
It looks great on the iPad. Yeah, they did a good job.
Good. Of course, I'm whenever I look at the book or whatever, I see the half a dozen typos that I missed. So that's always an annoyance for any author.
Okay, well, this is the end of the show. I'd like to say thank you to our special guest, Mick Broderick, who was actually in the lounge of Santiago Airport in Chile when we spoke to him. We recorded the interview on August 6, 2017, which coincidentally was Hiroshima Day. I'd like to also thank our host, Jason Furlong, who did a great job in the chat department. I'd also like to thank long-time SCAS admin and all-round Kubrick aficionado, James Marinaccio, for setting the interview up, and to Mark Lentz for providing the research for this episode. I'd also like to thank SCAS members Ian Roscoe and Anthony Adler, as well as James and Mark, for joining us on the call and adding some great questions for Mick. If you're looking to find out more about Mick's book, Reconstructing Strangelove, then go and get a copy from the usual outlets. If you want to take a look at the film Dr. Strangelove, then I would recommend the latest release of the film by Criterion, which includes new interviews with Peter George's son David, archivist Richard Daniels, camera operator Kelvin Park, as well as Mick Broderick, who you've just heard, and a bunch of other good stuff. If you're on Facebook, why not join our online community at the Stanley Kubrick Appreciation Society? We'll be back soon with a fantastic interview with Moonwatcher himself, Dan Richter. Tatty bye.
It's Kubrick's universe. We just live in it.
We have taken very thorough precautions in this podcast against broadcasting anything which might only be attributed to human error.